My father threw a $4,500 dinner bill at my plate in a crowded luxury steakhouse just to humiliate me. He laughed loudly and told everyone at the table I was a broke failure playing pretend with a useless tech startup. He had no idea the banking executive he was desperately trying to impress that night was about to stand up and announce to the entire room that I had just become a billionaire. The look of absolute horror on my father's face was just the beginning of my revenge. My name is Lilia. I am 33 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been the designated outcast of my family. Growing up in a wealthy household in upstate New York, love was never unconditional. It was measured in compliance status and how well you fit into the pristine corporate image my father Charles had meticulously built. My father was the chief executive of a legacy Wall Street wealth management firm, a man who measured human worth strictly by the balance in their portfolio and the prestige of their job title. Tonight was supposed to be a rare family dinner at an ultra-exclusive Manhattan steakhouse. The kind of restaurant where the lighting is dim, the leather booths are imported from Italy, and the waitstaff anticipate your needs before you even realize you have them. I sat at the end of the long mahogany table nursing a glass of sparkling water, feeling the familiar suffocating weight of my family's presence pressing down on me. The air in our private dining alcove was thick with tension. My father had been checking his phone obsessively for the past hour. I knew from industry whispers that his firm was bleeding money and he was desperate for a bailout. He had booked this private room hoping to secure a meeting with a major banking executive who was dining in the same restaurant tonight. But as the hours ticked by, with no sign of his savior, his anxiety morphed into his favorite coping mechanism, which was taking his frustration out on me. When the waiter approached silently in his crisp white jacket and placed the black leather bill folder on the table, my father did not reach for it. Instead, he slid it down the polished wood directly until it hit my water glass. "You can get this one, Lilia," my father said, his voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Consider it your contribution to the family, since you are always taking up space and never giving anything back to the legacy I built." I stared at the leather folder. I did not need to open it to know it was astronomical. They had ordered the most expensive dry-aged tomahawk steaks, multiple appetizers of caviar and truffles, and my brother had selected 2 bottles of vintage wine that cost more than my rent used to be. I calmly opened the folder. The total printed at the bottom was exactly $4,520. I looked up at my father, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "You invited me here tonight to discuss family matters," I said quietly. "You know I do not eat meat or drink wine. I had a side salad and water." My mother Beatrice swirled her wine in her crystal glass and let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Oh, please do not start whining about money again, Lilia. It is exhausting." She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple navy blouse with unmistakable disdain. "If you had just listened to your father and married that hedge fund manager we introduced you to 5 years ago, you would not be sitting here wearing last season's clothes and crying over a dinner bill." I felt a familiar knot tighten in my stomach, but I refused to let it show on my face. This was their game. They loved to invite me to their opulent world just to remind me that I did not belong in it, to make me feel small and foolish for choosing my own path. My brother Preston leaned back in his chair and laughed. Preston was 35, a vice president at my father's firm and the undisputed golden child of the family. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his hands. He loved nothing more than stepping on me to elevate himself in our parents' eyes. "Come on, Lilia," Preston sneered, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "How is that little delivery startup going? Are you still operating out of a cramped garage with college kids? You have been playing pretend with this tech stuff for a decade. It is time to pay the piper. Earn your seat at the table for once." His words were designed to cut, but they only revealed his own ignorance. 10 years ago, when I graduated from college, my father demanded I take a junior position at his wealth management firm. He wanted me under his thumb, working for his legacy. When I refused, telling him I wanted to build my own software company, the fallout was explosive. He cut me off financially that very day, packed my bags, and told me I would be begging to come back within a month. I never begged. I worked 3 jobs to fund my servers. I slept on a mattress on the floor for 4 years. I taught myself coding and supply chain logistics while they vacationed in luxury resorts and mocked my absence. They thought I was struggling. They thought I was still that terrified 23-year-old girl they had thrown out. "Pay the bill, Lelia," my father ordered, his voice dropping into the harsh, commanding tone he used to terrify his junior employees. "You have drained whatever meager savings you had on this useless tech fantasy. Paying for your family's dinner tonight is the absolute least you can do to apologize for being such a massive embarrassment to my name. Maybe it will teach you some financial responsibility." I looked at the three of them, my father with his red, angry face, my mother with her performative disappointment, my brother with his arrogant, unearned confidence. For a decade, I had swallowed these insults. I had endured the holidays where I was seated at the edge of the table and spoken to like a charity case. I had kept my mouth shut while they bragged about their wealth and diminished my hard work. But tonight was different. Tonight, I did not feel the sting of their rejection. I only felt a deep, profound pity for how little they understood about the world shifting beneath their feet. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I reached into my purse. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my career. I simply pulled out a heavy, solid black metal card and placed it onto the silver tray inside the leather folder. My father saw the card and frowned slightly, clearly, not recognizing the specific tier of private banking it represented, but assuming I was putting myself into massive credit card debt just to appease him. A triumphant smirk began to form on his lips. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me and put me back in my designated place as the family failure. I slid the folder toward the edge of the table for the waiter. Just as I did, the heavy mahogany doors of our private dining room swung open. The sudden noise made my father jump. He turned his head irritably, ready to scold a waiter for the interruption, but the words died in his throat. Standing in the doorway was a man who commanded the attention of every room he entered. He was in his late 50s, wearing an immaculate charcoal suit with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed absolutely nothing. It was Harrison Thorne. Harrison was the ruthless, brilliant chief executive officer of the largest international banking conglomerate in the country. He was the exact man my father had been desperately trying to court all night. My father's firm was drowning in toxic debt, and a bailout from Harrison's bank was the only thing standing between my father and total bankruptcy. My father leaped up from his chair so fast it nearly tipped over backward. The arrogance he had directed at me seconds ago vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, fawning eagerness. He frantically smoothed his tie and took a step toward the door, extending his hand. "Harrison, what an absolute honor!" my father practically gasped, his voice dripping with forced charm. "I have been hoping to catch you all evening. Please come in, come in. I apologize for the tension in the room. We were just having a difficult conversation with my unsuccessful daughter. She can be quite stubborn, but she is leaving now, so we can discuss real business." My mother sat up straighter, putting on her best society smile while Preston quickly stood up to mirror our father's respectful posture. They were all completely focused on the billionaire, standing in the doorway, ready to throw me under the bus to secure his favor. But Harrison Thorne did not look at my father. He did not look at my mother or my brother. He did not even acknowledge my father's outstretched hand. Instead, Harrison stopped dead in his tracks. His sharp eyes scanned the room and landed directly on me, sitting quietly at the end of the table with my glass of water. The billionaire banking titan ignored my father completely, walked right past him, and stopped beside my chair. To the absolute shock of my entire family, Harrison extended his hand to me and bowed his head in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. Diane stood there, her chest heaving as she gripped my debit card so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. The echo of her calling me a selfish bride hung in the air of my condo. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the refrigerator. I looked away from Diane's flushed, furious face and turned my attention to Chase. My fiancé, the man I had spent the last 3 years building a life with, the man who had promised me he would handle his mother and her escalating financial demands. I expected him to step forward and intervene. I expected him to defend me, to remind her that my forensic accounting business was already paying for the venue, the open bar, and my own custom dress, while his family had promised to handle this single deposit. Instead, Chase let out a sharp, exasperated sigh and crossed his arms over his chest. He did not look at his mother with disappointment. He looked at me with open, undisguised irritation. The supportive partner I thought I knew vanished, replaced by a stranger whose charming mask was rapidly slipping away. "Just give her the 4-digit code, Whitney," Chase demanded, his voice thick with a new entitlement. "It is $45,000. You literally made twice that amount on your last corporate audit. Stop making this so difficult for everyone." I stared at him, my heart pounding a slow rhythm against my ribs. "I am not making anything difficult, Chase. I am holding you to the agreement we made. You promised your family would cover this vendor. I am not handing over my personal bank card, and I am not giving your mother my private PIN code so she can drain my business account." "She is going to be your mother-in-law," Chase snapped, taking a step toward me. His tone was no longer irritated. It was turning hostile. "She is family. When you marry me, your money becomes our money. You should be happy to help out. My mother has been stressed trying to plan this day for us, and you are acting like a cheap accountant." "I am acting like someone who respects her own hard work," I replied smoothly. I kept my posture straight, anchoring my feet to the hardwood floor. "If you do not have the funds for the deposit, we can scale back the floral arrangements, but my card stays in my wallet." Diane let out a dramatic, piercing scoff. She slapped the plastic card down on the marble kitchen island. "See?" she said to her son, her voice dripping with venom. "I told you she was like this. She thinks because she owns a financial firm she can control us. She has no respect for how a real family operates. She is going to hold her money over your head for the rest of your marriage, Chase." Chase's face darkened, a dangerous shade of red creeping up his neck. The charming man who had proposed to me was entirely gone. He took another step forward, closing the distance until he was standing inches from my face. The scent of his expensive cologne felt suffocating. I took a step back, attempting to create some space, but my back bumped against the edge of the kitchen counter. I was boxed in. The open concept layout of my condo felt like a trap. Chase was deliberately standing directly between me and the hallway leading to the front door. "You are going to give her the code," Chase said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. It was a command, not a request. "You are not going to disrespect my mother in our home." "This is my home, Chase," I reminded him quietly. "The mortgage is entirely in my name, and I am asking both of you to leave." That was the snapping point, the absolute limit of his fragile ego. Chase's eyes went wide with a terrifying, unhinged rage. He leaned in, spit flying from his lips as he screamed the words right into my face. "Not even married and you are already selfish." Before I could even process the sheer volume of his voice, his body language shifted. He planted his feet, pulled his right shoulder back, and raised his fist high into the air. His eyes were wild, consumed by an anger that had clearly been simmering for years. He fully expected me to flinch. He expected me to cower in submission, to shrink down against the marble counter and beg for him to stop. He wanted me to be small, to be terrified, to be the obedient woman his mother desperately wanted me to be. But I did not freeze, I did not shrink, and I certainly did not close my eyes. 3 years ago, after a high-profile fraud case resulted in threats against my firm, I had enrolled in a specialized self-defense training program. I had spent 3 evenings a week learning how to read body mechanics and neutralize a threat efficiently. As Chase's fist hung in the air, time seemed to slow down. My training kicked in with absolute mechanical precision. Maintaining unwavering ice-cold eye contact with him, I shifted my weight to my left foot. I did not try to block his raised hand. Instead, I targeted his foundation. With maximum force, I drove the heel of my right foot directly into the side of his left knee. The sound of the impact was a sickening thud, followed instantly by a sharp crack. I had struck the joint exactly where it was most vulnerable, hyperextending his knee sideways. The joint gave way immediately. Chase's eyes bulged in shock, his raised fist dropping as the structural support of his leg collapsed beneath him. An agonizing groan ripped from his throat as he crumpled to the hardwood floor, clutching his knee. He writhed on the ground, his face pale with blinding pain. Diane shrieked in absolute horror, her hands flying to her mouth as she watched her son writhing on the kitchen floor. "What did you do?" she screamed hysterically, stopping short, too terrified of me to get close. "You broke his leg, you crazy woman, you broke his leg." I defended myself, I stated calmly, my breathing remarkably steady. I did not look at her. My eyes remained on Chase, making sure he was no longer a threat. He was far too busy moaning in agony to try anything else. I stepped around his thrashing body and walked over to the kitchen island. I reached out, picked up my debit card from the marble surface and slid it back into my wallet. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring sparkled under the pendant lights. I slid the ring off my finger. I held the ring over his half-empty coffee mug and let it drop. It landed with a soft plop, sinking to the bottom of the cold coffee. "The wedding is off," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet spaces between Chase's groans. I did not wait for Diane to respond. I walked to the entryway table, picked up my laptop bag, and slung it over my shoulder. I opened my front door, stepped into the hallway, and let the heavy door click shut behind me. As I pulled out my phone to call my security team, I knew the war had just begun. The heavy door of my condo clicked shut behind me, sealing away the sound of Diane's screaming and Chase's groans. I stood in the quiet hallway, my chest heaving as the adrenaline drained from my system. My knuckles gripped my laptop bag tightly. I had just dismantled the man I thought I was going to marry. I took a deep breath to steady my heart. There was no going back. The charming partner I thought Chase was had evaporated, leaving behind a stranger who believed he could intimidate me into funding his mother's lifestyle. I walked down the hall and pressed the button for the elevator. My mind was racing, cataloging the steps I needed to take. I was a forensic accountant. My career was built on logic and tracing truth through deception. I needed to apply that clinical logic to my own life. I could not stay in that condo tonight. Sharing space with Chase and Diane was no longer an option. I needed a secure environment to process the cancellation of my wedding. I took a rideshare to a luxury hotel downtown. The quiet elegance of the lobby was a stark contrast to the chaotic battlefield my kitchen had just become. I checked into a corner suite, handing over my credit card. The desk clerk offered a polite smile, completely unaware that I had just dropped a diamond ring into a mug of cold coffee and shattered my future. Once inside the room, I locked the heavy door, engaged the deadbolt, and let my bag drop to the floor. The silence of the room was absolute. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the city lights outside. I naturally assumed Chase would do the rational thing. I assumed that after the initial shock wore off, he would call his friends, pack his bags, and vacate my property. He knew the condo legally belonged to me. He knew I had the financial resources to enforce my boundaries. I figured he would take his hysterical mother and retreat. I turned my phone on silent, felt exhaustion settling deep into my core, and fell into a dreamless sleep. The morning sun streamed brightly through the sheer curtains, waking me to a reality that felt incredibly surreal. I ordered black coffee from room service and sat at the desk to begin dismantling my wedding. I had vendors to call, deposits to forfeit, and family to notify. It was going to be an exhausting day, but I was fully prepared to handle it with the exact efficiency I applied to my corporate audits. I picked up my phone from the nightstand and turned the sound profile back on. I expected to see missed calls from Chase begging for my forgiveness, or angry voicemails from Diane threatening to sue me. Instead, there was a single chillingly composed text message from Chase waiting on my home screen. I opened the message, my tired eyes scanning the dark words. The text was not an apology. It was not a notification that he had packed his bags and left my property. It read exactly like this: "I am back from the emergency room. Severe lateral ligament damage. Since I cannot walk and you violently assaulted me in our home, I have officially moved my mother into the master bedroom so she can take care of me. Do not bother coming back. We changed all the security access codes on the front smart lock. I stared at the glowing screen, a cold wave of utter disbelief washing over my body. He had actually moved Diane into my personal home. He had changed the security codes on a property he did not even own. My first instinct was to call the local police department immediately. I wanted to fiercely report a residential break in a hostile occupation of my sanctuary. I tapped the screen ready to dial the authorities when a second text message suddenly appeared from Chase. You might want to consult a lawyer before you try calling the cops. I have continuously lived in this condo for over 2 years. My legal name is on the internet and utility bills. I receive my official mail here. Under state law, I am considered a legal tenant. You cannot legally remove me or my registered medical caregiver without a formal 30-day eviction notice. If you try to force us out, I will press criminal charges for the unprovoked assault that caused my severe knee injury, and I will personally sue you for illegal eviction. Enjoy the hotel. The sheer audacity of his message hit me like a solid physical blow. The air in the spacious hotel room suddenly felt thin and hard to breathe. Chase was not just stubbornly refusing to leave my property. He was actively weaponizing the local legal system against me. He was deliberately invoking squatter and tenant rights to hold my home hostage. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew that the formal residential eviction process in our specific city was notoriously slow and heavily favored the current occupant over the rightful owner. He knew that any aggressive attempt to forcibly remove him would result in a messy, highly public legal battle that could permanently damage my professional reputation as a respected forensic accountant. He was trying to violently corner me all over again. He had failed to physically intimidate me in the kitchen last night, so he had cowardly pivoted to legal extortion this morning. He truly thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the terrifying threat of a public assault charge and a drawn-out eviction process would break my resolve and force me to financially negotiate with him and his greedy mother. I set the phone down on the desk and walked slowly to the window. I looked out over the busy city, feeling a quiet anger settling deep into my bones. Chase and Diane had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. They foolishly thought my financial success was just blind luck. They thought my wealth was something they could extract through cheap emotional manipulation and basic legal threats. They forgot my entire career was built on dismantling complicated frauds. I spent my days meticulously analyzing offshore shell companies, tracking hidden corporate assets, and destroying the comfortable lives of arrogant white-collar criminals who thought they were untouchable. Chase arrogantly thought he was perfectly safe just because his name was printed on a monthly water bill. He thought moving his toxic mother into my private master bedroom was a clever checkmate. He thought holding my peaceful sanctuary hostage would paralyze me with fear and force me to surrender. I walked back to the desk, opened my laptop, and powered it up with steady movements. I did not cry. I did not panic. I opened a secure encrypted communication portal and typed a detailed urgent message to the senior managing partner of my corporate legal team. I attached high-resolution screenshots of Chase's smug text messages and requested an immediate strategy meeting to discuss a total counteroffensive. Chase wanted to play a tedious legal game of attrition. He desperately wanted to drain my vast resources and test my patience by hiding behind tenant laws. He wanted war. I closed my laptop with a sharp snap. He was going to get one, but it would be a ruthless war fought entirely on my terms, and I was going to leave him with absolutely nothing. I did not waste another second sitting in that hotel room. I grabbed my coat and took a car directly to the local police precinct. I walked up to the front desk with my property deed, my mortgage statements, and my identification neatly organized in a manila folder. I calmly explained to the desk sergeant that my former partner was refusing to vacate my property after a physical altercation and had illegally moved an unauthorized guest into my home. Given the escalating hostility, I requested a civil standby. I needed uniformed officers to escort me to my own front door and formally remove the trespassers from my property. The desk sergeant reviewed my pristine documents and assigned 2 officers to accompany me. 30 minutes later, I was riding the mirrored elevator of my building, accompanied by the 2 imposing policemen. The taller officer, a veteran with silver hair and a heavy utility belt, stood with his arms crossed, while his younger partner reviewed the paperwork I had provided. My heart beat a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. I felt a surge of cold confidence. Chase thought a few text messages would keep me at bay. He was about to learn that I did not play games with my personal sanctuary. The elevator chimed softly, and the polished steel doors slid open to my floor. We walked down the carpeted hallway in silence. When we reached my door, I reached out and tapped the digital keypad. The smart lock flashed a harsh, angry red. Access denied. Chase had indeed wiped my master codes. The older officer stepped forward and knocked heavily on the solid wood door. The sound echoed loudly down the quiet corridor. We waited. A few moments later, the deadbolt clicked, and the door swung open just a few inches, stopped by the heavy brass security chain. Diane peered through the narrow gap. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw the dark blue uniforms, but she did not look afraid. She unlatched the chain and pulled the door wide open, acting as if she were the rightful lady of the house, being disturbed by door-to-door salesmen. She was wearing my silk bathrobe. The sight of her wrapped in my personal clothing sent a spike of pure revulsion through my stomach, but I kept my face entirely blank. I looked past her shoulder into the sprawling living room. Chase was stretched out on my custom Italian leather sectional sofa. His left leg was encased in a bulky black medical brace and elevated on a stack of my decorative throw pillows. He was holding a video game controller, looking completely unbothered by the police presence at the door. "Officers," Diane said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "How can we help you this morning?" "Ma'am, we are here with the legal property owner," the older officer said, gesturing to me. "She has requested that you and your son vacate the premises immediately. You do not have authorization to be in this residence." Chase let out a loud theatrical sigh from the couch. He tossed the game controller onto the glass coffee table and gingerly sat up. He reached down to the floor and picked up a thick stack of envelopes. "Officer, she might own the mortgage, but I live here. I have lived here continuously for over 2 years. She is just angry because our wedding was canceled yesterday, and now she is trying to illegally throw an injured man onto the street." Chase hobbled over to the doorway, leaning heavily on a pair of aluminum crutches. He handed the stack of mail directly to the older police officer. I watched as the officer flipped through the envelopes. Bank statements, car insurance bills, voter registration cards, and federal tax documents. Every single envelope bore Chase's legal name printed clearly above my home address. The older officer let out a heavy, tired breath. He handed the mail back to Chase and turned to look at me. The apologetic expression on his face told me everything I needed to know before he even opened his mouth. "Miss, I am very sorry, but my hands are legally tied," the officer explained, his voice low and sympathetic. "Because he receives official government and financial mail at this address, and because he has established a continuous pattern of residency, he is legally classified as a tenant under state law. The fact that his name is not on the deed or the lease does not matter right now. He has established tenancy. He does not pay rent," I stated clearly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "He has never contributed a single dollar to the mortgage, the property taxes, or the homeowners association fees. He is a guest who has overstayed his welcome, and the woman standing next to him does not even live in this zip code." "I understand your frustration, I truly do," the officer replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "But we are law enforcement, not the civil courts. We cannot physically drag a recognized tenant out of a residence without a formal eviction order signed by a judge. If we force him out today, we would be violating his tenant rights, and you would be liable for an illegal lockout lawsuit. You are going to have to take this to the housing court. It is strictly a civil matter now." I stared at the officer. The reality of the local housing laws crashed down on me. Chase had successfully weaponized the very system designed to protect vulnerable renters, twisting it to protect a parasite holding a luxury condo hostage. The police officers were legally helpless. They could not touch him. They tipped their hats respectfully, advised me to contact my attorney, and turned to walk back toward the elevator. As the officers retreated down the hallway, leaving me standing alone on my own welcome mat, Diane stepped fully into the doorway. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the silk of my bathrobe shimmering under the hallway lights. The sweet, innocent mother routine vanished instantly. A vicious, triumphant smirk spread across her face. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" Diane taunted, her voice dropping into a harsh, mocking whisper. "Did you actually think you could just snap your fingers and have the police throw us out like trash? You are not as smart as you think you are, Whitney." I looked at her, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset. "You are trespassing in a home paid for entirely by my hard work. You are sleeping in a bed bought with my money. You have absolutely no shame." Diane laughed, a sharp, grating sound that echoed off the hallway walls. "Your money. Please. You can dress up a girl from a working-class neighborhood in expensive tailored suits, but you still have absolutely no class. You are cold, you are calculating, and you have no concept of family loyalty. You think your little corporate accounting business makes you better than us. It just makes you a walking bank account." She stepped closer to the threshold, her eyes narrowing with a deep, ingrained entitlement that made my skin crawl. "My son wasted 3 of his best years putting up with your miserable, controlling personality. He sacrificed his youth pretending to care about your boring audits and your spreadsheets. Your wealth rightfully belongs to him as compensation for enduring you. This condo is the absolute bare minimum of what he deserves. We are not leaving, Whitney. We are going to stay right here, sleeping in your bed and eating your food until you write us a check large enough to make us go away." The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air between us. She was openly admitting to extortion. She was proudly declaring that my years of relentless hard work, my late nights at the office, and my professional success were nothing more than a payout owed to her mediocre son for simply existing in my presence. They felt entirely justified in stealing my home because they believed my money existed solely to fund their comfort. I did not scream. I did not insult her back. I simply looked at Diane with a gaze so incredibly hollow and devoid of emotion that her triumphant smirk began to falter. I looked at Chase, who was standing behind her on his crutches, watching me with a smug, cowardly grin. They thought they had won a massive victory today. They thought a piece of mail and a slow housing court process made them invincible. They did not realize that by trapping themselves inside my property, they had just given me all the time I needed to completely destroy their lives. I turned my back on them without uttering a single word. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway, listening to the heavy slam of my own front door closing behind me. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The civil courts would take months to evict them, but I was not going to wait for the slow wheels of justice. I was going to starve them out, dismantle their financial security, and make them beg to leave my home. I walked back into the lobby of my luxury hotel, my mind already calculating the first logical steps of my counteroffensive. I needed to freeze the joint accounts we had set up for the wedding and ensure my personal credit was entirely isolated from anything bearing his name. I stepped into the elevator, feeling the adrenaline of the morning confrontation finally begin to settle into a cold, sustainable focus. When I unlocked the door to my corner suite, the heavy silence of the room offered a brief moment of comfort. I took off my coat, draped it over the back of an armchair, and walked over to the desk where I had left my laptop. I sat down and reached into my bag to retrieve my phone, intending to call my bank. Before my fingers could even unlock the screen, the device began vibrating violently against the wood grain of the desk. It was not just one call or a single text message. The screen lit up with a relentless, rapid-fire stream of notifications. Dozens of alerts stacked on top of each other in a matter of seconds. I picked up the phone, my brow furrowing in confusion. The messages were not coming from my legal team or the local police precinct. They were pouring in from various social media applications, text threads with my bridesmaids, and group chats with mutual friends I shared with Chase. I tapped the first message that popped up on my screen. It was from a woman I had known since college who was supposed to be reading a poem at my wedding ceremony. Her message was incredibly brief and sharp. She wrote that she was absolutely disgusted by my behavior and told me to never contact her again. My heart did a strange, unsteady flutter. I swiped away her text and opened the primary social media application on my phone. My notifications tab was completely overwhelmed with tags, mentions, and direct messages. At the very top of my feed was a newly published post from Chase. I clicked on his profile. The first thing I saw was a highly staged, pathetic photograph. It showed his left leg wrapped heavily in the bulky black medical brace elevated on my living room sofa. The lighting in the photo was deliberately dim and moody, casting deep shadows that made his injury look as dramatic as possible. Sitting right beside his braced knee, looking mournful and deeply distressed, was Diane. She was holding a cup of tea, staring at the camera with wide, tear-filled eyes. I read the text attached to the photograph, and a wave of pure, icy nausea washed over me. Chase had written a long, calculated, tear-jerking narrative designed to completely assassinate my character. He painted himself as the tragic victim of a toxic, financially abusive relationship. He claimed that for the past 3 years I had used my wealth as a weapon to control his every move, isolating him from his loved ones and constantly belittling his career choices. The lies grew darker and more twisted with every sentence. Chase wrote that the stress of the wedding planning had caused my abusive tendencies to escalate into unprovoked physical violence. He told his hundreds of followers that when his elderly mother simply asked a harmless question about the catering budget, I flew into a blind, terrifying rage. He claimed that when he bravely stepped in front of his mother to protect her from my violent outburst, I viciously attacked him, shattering his knee and leaving him permanently disabled. He ended the post by saying he was heartbroken that the woman he loved had turned out to be a monster, and he asked for prayers as he and his terrified mother tried to recover in the safe space of his home. The sheer scale of his fabrication was breathtaking. He had taken the reality of his extortion, his mother's greed, and his own physical aggression, and completely inverted the truth. He had cast himself as the noble, injured protector, and branded me as an unstable, violent abuser. I scrolled down to the comment section, and the reality of my new isolation hit me like a physical weight. The post already had hundreds of comments, likes, and shares. People I had known for years were flooding his page with overwhelming sympathy and support. Mutual friends extended network connections, and even colleagues from my broader professional circle were leaving messages of horror and outrage. They called me a sociopath. They called me a cold, rich elitist who thought money gave me the right to assault people. People I had invited into my home, people I had bought expensive dinners for, were publicly wishing for my downfall. My phone buzzed again. It was a text message from a couple we had vacationed with just last summer. The message called me a disgusting coward and demanded I pay for his medical bills. Another text came through from my own wedding planner stating she was dropping me as a client due to the disturbing allegations and would be retaining my massive deposit. The backlash was swift, brutal, and entirely coordinated. Chase knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that society is incredibly quick to believe a story about a wealthy, powerful woman stepping on a struggling working-class man. He used all the right buzzwords. He used financial abuse, unprovoked assault, and protecting his elderly mother to ensure no one would ever question his side of the story. I sat alone in the hotel suite, watching the hateful messages multiply on my screen. I felt a suffocating sense of isolation closing in around me. My entire social safety net had been completely vaporized in less than an hour. The bridesmaids who were supposed to stand beside me at the altar had blocked my number. The friends who had toasted our engagement were publicly dragging my name through the mud. I was entirely alone. For a brief, agonizing moment, I felt the intense urge to cry. I wanted to type out a frantic emotional response. I wanted to scream into the digital void that he was the one who raised his fist, that Diane was the one demanding $45,000, and that they were currently squatting in a condo paid for exclusively by my forensic accounting business. I wanted to post pictures of the mortgage deed and the bank statements to prove my innocence to people who used to be my friends. But I stopped my trembling fingers before they could strike the keyboard. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced the emotional panic down into a dark, locked box inside my mind. I could not fight a public relations war driven by raw emotion. If I responded with anger, if I sounded defensive or hysterical online, I would only prove his carefully crafted narrative right. I realized in that quiet hotel room that I was backed into a dark corner, completely stripped of my social support system. I had no one to rely on but myself. But Chase had made a massive, arrogant miscalculation. He thought destroying my social life would break my spirit. He thought isolating me would make me surrender and pay his extortion fee. He forgot that I spent my entire life working in isolation. He forgot that my professional intellect was built on quietly gathering undeniable empirical evidence. He had just handed me a public time-stamped record of his defamation, creating a permanent digital footprint of his lies. I took a portable storage drive from my leather bag and securely connected it to my computer. My hands moved with practiced precision as I began taking dozens of high-resolution screenshots of his post, meticulously capturing every single comment, every share, and every malicious accusation. I created a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive specifically dedicated to his digital smear campaign. He wanted to play a public game of character assassination, completely unaware that defamation cases relied on exactly this kind of documented malice. I turned off the notifications on my phone, silencing the endless stream of hatred from people who never truly knew me. I opened a blank spreadsheet, flipped open my legal pad, and began to methodically build my case. I looked down at the neatly organized columns on my laptop screen in my hotel suite. Building a case against Chase and Diane required more than forensic accounting. It required a legal predator. I dialed the only person I trusted to handle this situation with the ruthlessness it deserved. Roxanne was not just an old college friend. She was a senior litigation partner at one of the most feared real estate and civil law firms in the city. I did not waste time exchanging pleasantries. I laid out the situation from the physical altercation in my kitchen to the text messages claiming squatter rights. I told her about the smear campaign and the complete isolation I was currently facing. Roxanne listened in complete silence. She did not offer empty sympathy. Instead, she asked for the spelling of their legal names. She told me to email the deed to the condo utility bills and screenshots of his threats. She promised to have a formal 30-day eviction notice drafted, filed with the housing court, and hand-delivered by a private process server before noon. Hearing Roxanne take immediate aggressive action sent a wave of relief through my body. The housing court process might be notoriously slow, but the clock was officially ticking. Chase believed I would be paralyzed by his public defamation and the police inability to act. He thought I would cower in a hotel room and try to negotiate a quiet surrender. Serving him with a formal legal eviction was my way of letting him know the negotiation phase never even existed. I spent the next 3 days barricaded inside my hotel suite, entirely focused on my accounting work. I channeled every ounce of my anger into my audit cases, finding comfort in the absolute certainty of numbers and ledgers. I kept my phone on a strict filter, ignoring hateful messages from mutual friends. I was waiting for Roxanne to call with an update on the eviction process, but the silence from Chase was oddly unsettling. The fact that he had not lashed out after receiving the formal eviction notice meant he was planning something else. My answer arrived on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was sitting at the hotel desk reviewing a tax return when someone knocked sharply on my door. I assumed it was the lunch I had ordered an hour ago. I stood up, walked across the plush carpet, and pulled the heavy door open. A man in a beige trench coat was standing in the hallway. He did not have a room service tray. He looked at my face, glanced down at a small notepad in his hand, and asked if I was Whitney. I nodded cautiously, feeling a sudden chill ripple down my spine. The man reached into his coat, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and pressed it directly against my chest. He told me I had been formally served, then turned around and walked briskly toward the elevator. I closed the door slowly, my hands trembling as I stared at the sealed envelope. The return address in the top corner belonged to a personal injury law firm located across the city. It was the kind of firm that advertised on highway billboards, known for filing aggressive lawsuits to force quick settlements. I walked back to the desk, sat down, and tore the top of the envelope open. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy bond paper. The bold capitalized letters at the top of the first page identified it as a civil complaint filed in the county superior court. Chase was the plaintiff. I was the sole defendant. I began to read the allegations, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My heart hammered against my ribs with a mixture of disbelief and rising fury. Chase was not just suing me. He had constructed a completely unhinged, heavily exaggerated legal narrative based entirely on the lies he had posted on social media. The lawsuit officially accused me of malicious and unprovoked physical assault. He claimed that my defensive kick to his knee was a premeditated attack designed to permanently disable him. The document stated that because his lateral ligament was severely torn, he would require extensive reconstructive surgery and months of painful physical therapy. But the allegations did not stop at physical injury. Chase was suing me for severe emotional distress. His lawyer devoted 3 entire pages to describing how my controlling behavior had caused him immense psychological trauma. He claimed he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety that required ongoing psychiatric treatment. The most absurd section of the lawsuit detailed his claims for loss of future income. Chase worked a mediocre marketing job that he barely managed to keep. Yet his lawyer confidently asserted that his knee injury had derailed a highly lucrative career trajectory. They claimed the trauma of my assault had rendered him unable to perform his professional duties, destroying his earning potential. I turned to the final page of the complaint, where the specific legal demands were outlined. I fully expected to see a request for his medical bills to be covered. What I actually saw made my vision blur with sheer unadulterated rage. Chase was demanding a comprehensive financial settlement of exactly $250,000. He wanted $250,000 transferred into his personal bank account within 30 days to compensate for his pain, suffering, and lost wages. But the lawsuit contained an alternative clause, a terrifying ultimatum designed to push me completely over the edge. His lawyer stated that if I refused to pay the $250,000, Chase would graciously accept the physical deed to my luxury condo as a full and final settlement. He was officially demanding that I sign my home over to him permanently. The pieces of his malicious strategy fell into place. He had orchestrated the smear campaign to destroy my public credibility, ensuring that if this went to trial, the court of public opinion would already view me as a violent monster. He had moved his mother into my home and invoked squatter rights to ensure I could not return. Now he was using a predatory personal injury lawsuit to force a financial surrender. He knew I was a respected forensic accountant. He knew a public civil trial involving assault and emotional abuse could destroy my corporate career and alienate my high-profile clients. He thought I would panic about my professional reputation and hand over the deed to my home to make the nightmare disappear. He thought he had outmaneuvered me on every front. I placed the stack of legal documents down on the hotel desk and smoothed the pages out with my hands. I did not feel the crushing, paralyzing fear Chase was counting on. The anxiety that had been buzzing in my chest since the morning of the breakup completely evaporated. The predatory lawsuit was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand how far he was willing to go. Chase and Diane had crossed an irreversible line. They turned a domestic dispute into a documented attempt at legal extortion. They wanted to use the legal system to steal my wealth and ruin my life. I picked up my phone to call Roxanne, feeling a calm settle into my soul. I was going to accept his legal challenge, but I was going to use his own greedy lawsuit to bury him. I dialed Roxanne's direct line from the hotel desk, keeping my eyes fixed on the ridiculous lawsuit. She answered on the second ring. I told her I had just been served by a predatory personal injury firm, and I summarized Chase's outrageous demands for $250,000 or the deed to my home. Roxanne let out a low chuckle that sent a wave of reassurance through my chest. She told me to pack up the documents and meet her at her downtown office immediately. We were not going to wait for a court date to start tearing his fabricated narrative apart. An hour later, I was sitting in Roxanne's spacious corner office surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Roxanne sat behind her massive glass desk, carefully reading through the pages of the civil complaint. She highlighted specific paragraphs with a bright yellow marker. She explained that Chase had made a massive strategic error by filing this lawsuit. In his arrogant attempt to extort me, he had legally opened the door to a massive discovery process. We now had the legal right to subpoena his private text messages, his financial records, and the medical charts from his emergency room visit. Roxanne leaned forward, interlacing her fingers. She told me that defending against a frivolous lawsuit was easy, but our goal was to make it spectacularly painful for him. We were going to file an aggressive countersuit for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We would depose his mother. We would subpoena the local police officers who responded to the civil standby. We were going to build a fortress of empirical evidence. As Roxanne began outlining the timeline for our legal filings, a sharp, piercing alarm echoed through the quiet office. It was the specialized high-priority emergency alert tone I had programmed into my phone specifically for my primary financial institutions. I pulled my phone out of my bag, my heart giving a sudden thump against my ribs. The screen was flashing a bright red fraud warning from the private wealth management division of my bank. I answered the call immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to David, my dedicated private wealth manager. He asked me to confirm my identity using my secure verbal passphrase. Once I provided it, David's tone turned serious. He asked if I had recently authorized a secondary mortgage application for the luxury condo currently listed as my primary residence. He stated that the bank's automated fraud detection software had flagged the transaction because of the unusually high dollar amount and the expedited processing request. I froze. The blood drained from my face, leaving a cold, tingling sensation spreading across my cheeks. I looked across the desk at Roxanne and put the call on speakerphone so she could hear every word. I told David with absolute certainty that I had not authorized any secondary mortgage. I had no outstanding debts on the property, and I was currently in the process of evicting a hostile tenant. I demanded to know exactly who had initiated the transaction and how much money they were attempting to extract. David tapped his keyboard, the sound carrying clearly through the speaker. He explained that a loan application had been submitted digitally less than 2 hours ago. The applicant was attempting to secure a cash-out refinance loan against my condo for the exact amount of $250,000. The applicant was Chase. David explained that Chase had provided the bank with my Social Security number, copies of my recent tax returns, and a supposedly notarized power of attorney document granting him complete legal authority over my finances. Roxanne sat up completely straight, her eyes wide with shock. A cold, heavy silence filled the office. Chase was not just waiting for his predatory lawsuit to slowly work its way through the civil courts. He was actively trying to steal the exact amount of his settlement demand directly from my property equity right now. He had leveraged his physical occupation of my condo to locate my highly sensitive personal tax files. He was using his unauthorized access to my home office to commit severe, premeditated identity theft. I instructed David to freeze the transaction immediately and place a hard lock on every single financial account tied to my Social Security number. I authorized him to flag the application as an active case of severe financial fraud. David assured me the funds had not been released and the mortgage application was permanently terminated. I then asked him to securely email the entire application file directly to my secure encrypted work address. I needed to see exactly what Chase had submitted to the bank. David confirmed the transfer. A few minutes later, my laptop chimed with an incoming encrypted email. Roxanne walked around her desk and stood right behind my chair as I downloaded the files. I opened the digital packet, my eyes scanning the heavily doctored application forms. Chase had uploaded photographs of my property deed alongside highly confidential tax forms I kept stored in a locked filing cabinet inside the master bedroom. He and Diane had physically broken into my secured office furniture while squatting in my home. But the most horrifying document was the power of attorney form. I expanded the image of the power of attorney document on my screen. It looked incredibly official, complete with a digital notary stamp and a signature that perfectly matched my own. Chase had clearly traced my signature from old wedding vendor contracts and digitally superimposed it onto the legal form. He had fabricated an elaborate, fraudulent authorization granting him the unrestricted right to borrow massive sums of money against my personal real estate. He had fully intended to secure the cash and leave me saddled with a massive fraudulent mortgage. Roxanne let out a sharp breath, placing her hands on the back of my chair. She stated quietly that the situation had just fundamentally changed. This was no longer a messy domestic dispute or a frustrating civil eviction battle. Chase had just crossed a massive, terrifying line into federal territory. Forging a power of attorney and submitting it to a federally insured banking institution in an attempt to extract $250,000 was wire fraud, identity theft, and severe bank fraud. He had escalated his greedy retaliation into undeniable major felonies. I stared at the forged signature on my laptop screen, feeling the dynamic of the entire war instantly shift. Chase arrogantly thought he was untouchable. He believed his tear-jerking social media posts and his predatory personal injury lawsuit gave him all the leverage he needed to bully me into submission. He thought outsmarting a forensic accountant simply required a few fake documents and a locked door. He had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I closed the document viewer and looked up at Roxanne. The anxiety and frustration of being socially isolated by his smear campaign completely vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp, dangerous clarity. Chase had just handed me the undeniable evidence required to put him in a federal prison. I told Roxanne to draft a preservation of evidence letter to the bank and to contact her connections in the white-collar crime division. The narrative was no longer a bad breakup. It had officially become a high-stakes financial thriller, and I was going to ensure Chase lost absolutely everything exactly as planned. The adrenaline from the thwarted wire fraud was still humming steadily through my veins as I pulled my chair closer to Roxanne's glass desk. I did not want to just close the file and wait for the federal authorities to handle the situation. That was not how my mind worked. I was a forensic accountant, and my entire career was built on the obsessive need to follow the digital paper trail until every single penny was accounted for. Chase had submitted an elaborate forged application to extract $250,000 from my property equity. But a loan application of that magnitude required specific disbursement instructions. He had to tell the bank exactly where to send the stolen funds once the mortgage was approved. I navigated through the encrypted digital packet David had sent me, bypassing the forged signatures and the stolen tax returns, looking for the final payout authorization forms. I found the document labeled for wire transfer instructions near the very bottom of the file stack. I clicked to expand the image on my screen. Roxanne leaned over my shoulder, her eyes tracking my cursor. Chase had requested that the total loan amount be split into two separate transactions. The first transfer was for $205,000, directed straight to his personal checking account. But it was the second transfer instruction that caught my immediate attention. He had directed the remaining $45,000 to be wired immediately upon approval to a completely different bank account, classifying it as an urgent priority disbursement. I stared at the bold black numbers printed on the fraudulent banking form. The routing number did not match the local credit union Chase and Diane used for their personal finances. I recognized the first four digits of the American Bankers Association routing number. It belonged to a massive top-tier commercial institution that exclusively handled corporate accounts and large-scale business transactions. Chase was trying to funnel $45,000 directly into a corporate entity. I opened a new secure tab on my laptop and accessed a professional financial database I frequently used for my corporate audits. I typed the 9-digit routing number into the search bar, followed by the specific account number he had listed on the disbursement form. I hit the Enter key and waited as the database cross-referenced the institutional registries. The screen loaded a few seconds later, displaying the registered owner of the destination account. The name printed in bold green letters on my screen was Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. It was the boutique luxury real estate brokerage where Chase currently worked as a mid-level marketing director and property manager. But the account was not a standard corporate operating fund or a payroll ledger. The specific designation listed right below the company name read Client Escrow Trust. Roxanne let out a low whistle, stepping back from my screen and crossing her arms over her chest. She asked me why in the world Chase would be attempting to funnel stolen mortgage funds into his employer's escrow account. The question hung in the quiet air of the law office, and as I stared at the words on the screen, the scattered pieces of the past 48 hours suddenly slammed together with terrifying clarity. Escrow accounts in the luxury real estate sector are sacred, highly regulated financial vessels. They are designed to safely hold massive sums of money, usually earnest money deposits or down payments provided by wealthy clients who are in the process of purchasing multi-million-dollar homes. Real estate brokers are strictly forbidden by federal law from commingling those client funds with general operating money, and they are absolutely prohibited from withdrawing a single cent for personal use. Doing so is not just a minor regulatory violation. It is severe, immediate grounds for losing a real estate license and facing major federal embezzlement charges. I closed my eyes as the memory of the morning in my kitchen washed over me. I saw Diane standing by the marble island aggressively demanding my debit card. I heard the exact words she had screamed at me. She had demanded exactly $45,000. She had claimed it was for a sudden, unexpected catering and floral deposit for our upcoming wedding. But I had already paid the venue in full, and Chase had sworn his family was handling the florists. The wedding deposit was a complete lie. It was a desperate, fabricated cover story designed to hide a massive financial crime. Chase had not needed my money to pay for white roses or a champagne toast. I opened my eyes and looked at Roxanne. I explained the revelation with cold, clinical precision. Chase had embezzled exactly $45,000 from his luxury real estate firm's client escrow account. He had likely skimmed the funds weeks or even months ago, thinking he could float the stolen money to fund his expensive lifestyle, pay off hidden debts, or satisfy Diane's constant demands for luxury goods. But the real estate market was heavily regulated, and routine corporate audits were mandatory. His firm must have scheduled an upcoming quarterly audit, or a wealthy client was suddenly preparing to close on a house, meaning the escrow funds needed to be immediately verified and released. Chase was completely trapped. He was staring down the barrel of an imminent corporate audit that would effortlessly expose his massive theft and send him directly to federal prison. He needed to replace the missing $45,000 immediately before the company accountants discovered the gaping hole in the escrow ledger. That was why he had cornered me in the kitchen. That was why he had demanded my personal bank card with such unhinged, violent desperation. When his physical intimidation failed, and I canceled the wedding, his timeline for returning the stolen money collapsed. He panicked. He moved his mother into my condo and initiated the fraudulent secondary mortgage as a completely reckless last-ditch effort to save himself from prison. He was willing to commit severe mortgage fraud and identity theft just to desperately dump $45,000 back into the client escrow account and cover his tracks before his employer realized the money was gone. The remaining $205,000 he tried to borrow was just pure, unadulterated greed to set himself up after the dust settled. Roxanne stared at me, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. She walked back around her massive glass desk and sank deeply into her leather chair. The dynamic of our entire legal strategy had just shifted from a defensive posture into an absolute slaughter. Chase was not just a stubborn squatter hiding behind local housing laws, and he was not just an angry ex-fiancé throwing a temper tantrum on social media. He was an active, desperate embezzler standing on the edge of a massive corporate cliff. He had unwittingly handed me the exact weapon I needed to utterly destroy his entire life and reputation. I closed the encrypted digital file and folded my hands together securely on my lap. I did not need to wait for a slow eviction judge to politely ask him to leave my property. I simply needed to pick up my cell phone and make a highly informative, anonymous phone call directly to the Chief Compliance Officer at Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. I was going to trigger the audit myself, ensuring he lost absolutely everything. Roxanne reached across the glass desk and placed her hand over mine, stopping me before I could pick up my phone. She shook her head, her expression sharpening into the calculating gaze of a litigator. She explained that making an anonymous phone call to the compliance officer at Vanguard Pinnacle Estates was a tactical error. In the world of luxury real estate, managing brokers often tried to quietly sweep internal embezzlement under the rug to protect the firm's reputation. If I tipped them off, the partners might panic fire Chase and secretly replace the missing $45,000 themselves to avoid a public scandal. Chase would lose his job, but he might escape federal prosecution. Roxanne leaned back and stated that if we wanted to ensure he went to prison, we needed to light a fire no corporate executive could extinguish. We needed an undeniable paper trail that forced the hand of state and federal regulators. I pulled my hand back from my phone and took a deep breath. Roxanne was right. I was letting adrenaline cloud my professional judgment. I needed to approach this execution with the same methodical precision I applied to my corporate fraud audits. I turned my attention back to my laptop screen, opening a new browser window. I told Roxanne that if Chase was trying to replace $45,000 before a mandatory audit, there had to be an impending deadline driving his panic. Embezzlers do not steal money with the intention of getting caught. They steal with the arrogant assumption that they can secretly replace the funds before anyone notices the ledger is bleeding. I logged into the Municipal Property Registry and cross-referenced it with the Regional Multiple Listing Service database. I typed in Chase's legal name and his real estate license number. The screen populated with his current professional portfolio at Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. I bypassed his active listings and clicked directly into the properties marked as pending. I slowly scrolled through the digital records, scanning the sale prices and contractual timelines. I bypassed a modest townhouse and a small commercial lease. Then my cursor stopped on a historical luxury estate located in the most affluent zip code in the city. The property was currently under contract for exactly $4.5 million. I clicked into the detailed transaction history. The standard earnest money deposit required to secure a luxury contract of that magnitude in our market was exactly 1% of the total purchase price. 1% of $4.5 million was exactly $45,000. The pieces of Chase's financial crime locked into place with mathematical perfection. I turned the laptop screen toward Roxanne so she could see the undeniable proof. I mapped out the timeline for her, letting the cold reality of his actions fill the quiet office. 3 weeks ago, Chase had represented Vanguard Pinnacle Estates in securing the contract for this massive luxury property. The buyer had provided a $45,000 wire transfer for the earnest money deposit. Chase was legally obligated to deposit those funds into Vanguard's client escrow trust. Instead, he had intercepted the money. He had diverted the deposit directly into his own personal accounts. Roxanne stared at the screen, her eyes tracing the dates on the contract. She pointed a manicured finger at the projected closing date listed at the bottom of the page. The luxury estate was officially scheduled to close next Friday. My breath hitched in my throat, as the magnitude of his desperation made perfect sense. When a real estate transaction reaches the closing table, the title company and closing attorneys formally request the disbursement of the earnest money from the broker's escrow account to finalize the sale. Chase knew that next Friday, the closing attorneys were going to look into Vanguard's escrow ledger and find it short by $45,000. The theft would be instantly discovered by independent financial institutions. He had less than 8 days to replace the stolen money. That was why he had attacked me in my kitchen. He had demanded my debit card under the pathetic guise of a wedding deposit because he thought he could bully me into covering his felony. When I canceled the wedding and walked out, his timeline for survival completely collapsed. He realized he was staring at a federal indictment. In his blind, unhinged panic, he had moved his mother into my condo to secure a stronghold, dug through my filing cabinets to steal my tax returns, and committed extreme mortgage fraud. He was willing to risk everything to extract the equity from my home, just to secretly refill the escrow account before the closing attorneys triggered the alarm next Friday. Roxanne stood up from her chair and began pacing the length of her office. The click of her heels against the hardwood floor sounded like a ticking clock. She told me that we were not going to call his employer. Instead, we were going to directly notify the State Real Estate Commission, the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the specific title company assigned to handle the closing of the luxury estate. We were going to provide them with the encrypted file showing his fraudulent mortgage application and his desperate attempt to wire funds directly into the Vanguard escrow account. By notifying the independent title company and state regulators simultaneously, we would create an explosive regulatory crossfire. Vanguard Pinnacle Estates would be legally forced to freeze Chase's real estate license, lock him out of their corporate servers, and turn him over to the federal authorities to protect their own operating charter. I sat back in my chair, feeling a sense of calm wash over my tired body. For the past 4 days, Chase had subjected me to a campaign of psychological and legal torture. He had smeared my name across social media, turning my friends against me with vicious lies. He had labeled me a violent, financially abusive monster. He had mocked my working-class roots and proudly declared that my wealth rightfully belonged to him. He thought his manipulative tears and his fake knee brace made him the smartest person in the room. He failed to realize that true financial power does not come from screaming in a kitchen or posting fabricated stories online. True power comes from the quiet, relentless pursuit of empirical truth. I opened a document on my laptop and began drafting the formal whistleblower complaint. I meticulously attached the digital footprints, the routing numbers, the forged power of attorney, and the property records. Every keystroke felt like I was driving a nail into the coffin of his future. I thought about Diane standing in the doorway of my condo, wearing my silk bathrobe and sneering that I had no class. She believed her son was a victim of my supposed cruelty. She was about to watch federal agents drag her precious entitled son out of my luxury condo in handcuffs. I finished assembling the digital evidentiary packet and securely forwarded it to Roxanne's inbox for her final legal review. I closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet office. The legal trap was completely set, the evidence was undeniable, and the federal hammer was about to fall. Roxanne and I did not spend another minute celebrating the discovery of the single stolen deposit. One anomaly in a corporate escrow account was a felony, but my instincts as a forensic accountant told me it was only a symptom of a much larger systemic infection. Embezzlers who steal $45,000 in a single desperate panic do not start with a sum that large. They start small, testing the fences, figuring out exactly where the regulatory blind spots are located. I packed my laptop and told Roxanne I needed an avalanche of public records by morning. Roxanne gave a sharp nod, reaching for her phone to mobilize her paralegal team. She promised to fast-track every subpoena she could justify under the umbrella of our impending civil litigation. I walked out of her office and took a car straight back to my hotel. I did not order room service. I immediately asked the concierge to send up 2 rolling whiteboards, dry erase markers, and a laser printer. I cleared the large dining table in the center of the suite and transformed the luxury room into a high-functioning corporate war room. By sunset, my suite looked like the staging ground for a federal task force. I had 3 monitors glowing, surrounded by stacks of property deeds, tax filings, and real estate records Roxanne had securely emailed. I poured coffee and cracked my knuckles. I was going to map out Chase's financial footprint from the moment we met to the present day. I was going to tear his fabricated life apart transaction by transaction. I started with the most basic metric of his profession. Chase constantly bragged about his status as a top-producing real estate broker. He wore custom suits, drove a leased sports car, and frequently posted photos from an exclusive country club. He always claimed his commission checks were waiting to clear, using that excuse to explain why I needed to cover our shared expenses. I opened the regional property database and pulled up his official production history. I set the search parameters for the last 24 months. I expected to find a mediocre sales record that barely supported his arrogant posture. What I actually found made me set my coffee mug down hard. Chase had not successfully closed a single luxury home sale in 8 consecutive months. His production volume for the entire year was absolute zero. The last time he earned a legitimate commission was almost a year ago on a minor commercial lease that barely covered 1 month of his country club dues. I stared at the barren spreadsheet. The mathematical reality was completely impossible. A man with zero incoming revenue does not drive a brand new sports car. A man with zero revenue does not casually pay thousands in monthly dues, nor does he support a mother who flaunts designer handbags and weekly spa treatments. If he was not earning money legitimately, he was extracting it from somewhere else. I picked up a red marker and walked to the whiteboard. I wrote his name at the top, followed by Diane's. I began to construct a timeline of his failed contracts. While his closing rate was non-existent, his rate of pending contracts was unusually high. Chase routinely represented buyers placing offers on multi-million-dollar estates, but those deals consistently fell through during the inspection periods. In a normal transaction, when a deal collapses, the earnest money deposit held in the broker's escrow account is promptly returned. I pulled up public court filings from the county clerk. I cross-referenced the addresses of his failed contracts with civil litigation records. A horrifying, meticulously organized pattern immediately began to emerge. I found dozens of active civil complaints filed by angry buyers against Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. These buyers were furiously demanding the return of their earnest money deposits. In every single case, Chase was the listed agent, claiming the funds were tied up in complex contractual disputes, intentionally stalling the return of the money. He was not just stalling. He was systematically bleeding the escrow accounts dry. I sat back at my laptop and began digging into the corporate shell companies associated with his and Diane's names. Roxanne had pulled the incorporation records for a boutique interior design firm registered exclusively to Diane. I tracked the routing numbers from the civil complaints and matched them against the subpoenaed vendor payment logs. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Chase and Diane were operating a massive, highly illegal embezzlement ring directly under the nose of his brokerage. Chase would secure a massive earnest deposit from a wealthy client and place it into the Vanguard Escrow Trust. Using his authority as property manager, he would fabricate fraudulent vendor invoices. He generated fake bills for luxury staging, property repairs, and interior design consultations. He authorized the payout of those fake invoices directly from the client escrow funds, wiring the stolen money straight into the shell company registered to his mother. Diane was not just a greedy parent living off her son. She was the primary money launderer for a corporate theft operation. Once the stolen earnest money hit her consulting account, she filtered the cash to fund their extravagant lifestyle. I traced the outgoing payments from her business ledger. The exact amounts matched the monthly lease payments on Chase's sports car. They matched the exorbitant initiation fees and dues for his elite country club. They matched the designer clothing Diane wore while she stood in my kitchen, calling me a cheap accountant. They had been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from innocent clients for 2 years. They were living like royalty entirely on stolen funds. Because the amounts were drawn from massive transaction pools, they had managed to fly under the radar of routine internal audits, shifting money from one failed contract to another to cover their tracks in an ongoing Ponzi scheme. But the scheme required a constant influx of new deposits to keep the illusion alive. When the real estate market naturally slowed down this quarter, their incoming cash flow completely evaporated. The music was stopping, and they were left holding an empty bag with a massive corporate audit looming on the horizon. That was why Diane had been so hysterical about extracting $45,000 from me. It was never about a wedding. The wedding was nothing more than a convenient fabricated excuse to strong-arm me into becoming their unwitting financial savior. They thought my forensic accounting firm generated enough wealth that I would just hand over the cash without asking any probing questions. I looked at the whiteboards covered in red ink connecting the invoices to Diane's shell company and Chase's failed contracts. The sheer audacity of their crime was breathtaking. They had looked me in the eye, called me a selfish bride, and tried to manipulate me into funding an active federal embezzlement ring. I called my friend Roxanne. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city skyline, casting a cold light into the hotel suite. I told her to wake up and get to the office. We were no longer just building a case to evict a hostile tenant. We were going to hand the federal government a perfectly wrapped indictment and ensure Diane and Chase went to prison together. This was not just about getting my own home back anymore. It was about delivering absolute, unrelenting, undeniable justice. I did not bother trying to sleep. The sun was fully above the horizon by the time I packed my heavily encrypted laptop and carried my portable hard drives down to the hotel lobby. My driver was waiting patiently at the curb. My mind was completely consumed by the massive financial web I had spent the entire night untangling. Roxanne met me in the lobby holding 2 massive cups of black coffee. She looked tired but buzzing with the same dangerous electric energy that was keeping me awake. We walked straight into her corner office, and I immediately connected my laptop to her large conference monitor. I brought up the intricate color-coded spreadsheets I had built overnight. I showed her the exact sequence of the stolen earnest money deposits, tracing the precise digital path from the luxury buyers into the Vanguard Pinnacle Estates, Client Escrow Trust, and straight out into the fraudulent interior design consulting account registered to Diane. Roxanne sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning the undeniable proof of the embezzlement ring. She agreed that the evidence was absolutely bulletproof, but she noted that something was still missing from the psychological profile of the crime. Chase had been running this Ponzi scheme for almost 2 years, floating stolen deposits from one failed contract to the next. He had managed to keep the illusion alive by carefully balancing the incoming cash with his outgoing luxury expenses. Embezzlers who successfully operate in the shadows for that long do not suddenly panic and try to extract $250,000 from their fiancée unless an external force is actively squeezing the air out of their lungs. The upcoming luxury property closing next Friday explained his immediate desperate need for $45,000. But the massive reckless secondary mortgage application he had attempted to take out on my condo pointed to a much larger systemic collapse. He was not just trying to cover one missing deposit. He was trying to build a massive cash reserve to cover his entire fraudulent history before someone looked too closely at his books. I sat down at the conference table and opened a new browser tab. I told Roxanne that corporate brokerages usually conduct their own internal audits annually, but those are often handled by friendly accountants who might overlook small discrepancies. If Chase was willing to commit federal wire fraud and severe identity theft to cover his tracks, he was not running from a friendly internal accountant. He was running from the government. I navigated directly to the official website for the State Real Estate Commission. Every licensed brokerage in the state was subject to periodic, unannounced financial compliance audits to ensure consumer funds were being properly managed. However, because the state agencies are notoriously underfunded and understaffed, they often publish a generalized regional audit schedule at the beginning of each quarter to ensure brokerages have their physical paperwork prepared for the inspectors. I clicked through the dense bureaucratic navigation menus, bypassing the licensing renewals and the continuing education portals. I finally located the Public Compliance Division directory. I downloaded the current quarterly audit schedule and opened the sprawling document on the large conference monitor. I hit the search command and typed in Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. The screen jumped to the middle of the document, highlighting the brokerage name in bright yellow. I read the column headers, my breath catching in the back of my throat. Vanguard Pinnacle Estates was not just scheduled for a routine compliance check. They were slated for a comprehensive Tier 1 financial regulatory audit scheduled to commence on the very last day of the current month. This specific type of audit meant state investigators were going to physically walk into the brokerage, freeze the accounting software, and demand a line-by-line reconciliation of every single penny sitting in the client escrow trust. They would cross-reference every active contract with the corresponding bank statements. If there was even a $1 discrepancy, the state would immediately suspend the managing broker's license and notify the federal authorities. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair, the final devastating piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place. I looked over at Roxanne, who was staring at the highlighted audit schedule with absolute disgust. I explained the exact timeline of their desperation. Chase and Diane had known this state audit was coming for weeks. They knew the state investigators would immediately spot the massive holes in the escrow ledger. They knew the fake invoices from Diane's interior design shell company would not survive 5 minutes of basic regulatory scrutiny. They were staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar fraud indictment, and they had absolutely zero legitimate revenue to replace the stolen cash. That was the exact moment they realized they needed a massive, unquestioning financial savior. They looked at me, the wealthy, oblivious forensic accountant they had successfully manipulated for 3 years. But they could not simply ask me for a random $250,000 without triggering my professional suspicions. They needed an airtight emotional cover story that would force me to open my checkbook without asking to see the receipts. The entire wedding catering crisis was a complete calculated fabrication. There was never a sudden demand from a florist. There was never an unexpected surge in the banquet costs. The $45,000 they had aggressively tried to extort from me in my kitchen was never meant to pay for white roses, champagne flutes, or a string quartet. It was a desperate last-ditch effort to replace the stolen earnest money for the upcoming Friday closing, hoping to plug the most obvious leak in their sinking ship before the state auditors arrived at the end of the month. When I refused to hand over my debit card, I did not just cancel a wedding. I inadvertently destroyed their only lifeline to freedom. Chase raised his fist and screamed at me because he was looking at a federal prison sentence, and my refusal sealed his fate. The profound sickness of their manipulations settled heavily into my chest. They had used the sacred concept of a marriage, a celebration of trust and partnership, as a cheap disguise for a federal bailout. Diane had stood in my home, wearing my clothes, calling me a selfish bride, because I would not unknowingly fund her money laundering operation. Chase had gone online and painted himself as the tragic victim of financial abuse to distract everyone from the fact that he was an active, desperate corporate thief. They had weaponized my love, my patience, and my professional success to shield themselves from the consequences of their own extraordinary greed. Any lingering feelings of betrayal or heartbreak completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, impenetrable armor of resolve. I was no longer the heartbroken fiancé trying to understand a sudden violent breakup. I was a specialized financial predator, and I had just cornered my prey. I turned back to my laptop and began attaching the state audit schedule to our growing evidentiary packet. I told Roxanne we were not going to wait for the state auditors to arrive at the end of the month. We were going to proactively send this entire explosive dossier directly to the lead investigator listed on the commission schedule today. We were going to hand them the map, the timeline, and the exact routing numbers. The wedding was definitively off, but the reckoning was fully prepared. I looked at the confirmation on the screen and took a slow breath. The digital dossier was on its way to the state regulatory investigators. Chase and Diane would still be squatting in my condo, sleeping in my bed, and proudly boasting about how they had defeated me for weeks while the government moved at its own bureaucratic pace. I was not willing to grant them another month of comfortable delusion. I needed them out of my home immediately, and I wanted to witness the exact moment their arrogant facade shattered into pieces. I turned back to Roxanne, who was efficiently organizing the printed legal files into her secure cabinet. I told her that submitting the whistleblower complaint was only half of the strategy. If the authorities quietly investigated Vanguard Pinnacle Estates, Chase might get tipped off by a nervous broker. He might try to flee or attempt to destroy the physical evidence located inside my condo. I needed to draw him out into the open. I wanted to design a trap that would completely maximize his public humiliation. Roxanne paused, slowly closing the cabinet drawer, and asked what exactly I had in mind. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. I explained that Chase had built his entire offensive strategy on the assumption that I was deeply terrified of social embarrassment. He filed that absurd lawsuit and demanded $250,000 because he expected me to panic over the public smear campaign. If we played into that exact narrative, if we gave him the exact reaction he was hoping for, he would swallow the bait without a second thought. I explicitly instructed Roxanne to reach out directly to the sleazy personal injury lawyer currently representing Chase. I told her to play the part of a deeply concerned defense attorney. We were going to pretend that I was utterly terrified of the social media backlash and the potential corporate fallout. We would communicate that I was willing to surrender and negotiate a highly confidential settlement just to make the entire lawsuit and public defamation go away. A slow, incredibly wicked smile spread across Roxanne's face. She understood the psychology of the trap instantly. By offering a rapid settlement, we were validating his delusion of power. We were telling an active embezzler who was days away from a massive corporate audit that a pile of clean cash was sitting right in front of him. His desperate need to replace the stolen earnest money before the closing date would completely override any residual caution. Roxanne picked up her sleek office phone and dialed the number listed on the civil complaint. She put the call on speaker so I could listen. The receptionist transferred her to a junior partner at the personal injury firm. Roxanne instantly shifted her demeanor, adopting a tone of hurried professional anxiety. She introduced herself and stated that her client, Whitney, was deeply distressed by the escalating public narrative. Roxanne mentioned that the social media posts were causing severe disruptions to my forensic accounting business, and my corporate board was demanding an immediate resolution to the domestic dispute. Roxanne paused for a dramatic effect, letting the junior partner absorb the fabricated vulnerability. She offered to arrange a private settlement conference to discuss fulfilling his financial demands, provided he signed an ironclad non-disclosure agreement and immediately vacated my property. She suggested meeting in her downtown office the following afternoon to expedite the financial transfer. The lawyer on the other end tried to maintain a tough exterior, but I could hear the unmistakable excitement bleeding into his voice. He promised to contact his client immediately and rush back with an answer. He hung up the phone, unaware that he had just guided his client directly into a fatal ambush. While we waited for the return call, I imagined the scene currently playing out inside my condo. I pictured Chase sitting on my custom leather sofa, his leg propped up in that ridiculous medical brace, receiving the call from his predatory lawyer. I visualized Diane clapping her hands together, a vindictive smile spreading across her face as she celebrated the validation of her relentless greed. They would undoubtedly view this proposed settlement as the absolute proof of their superior intelligence. Their shared delusion of grandeur would blind them to any logical inconsistencies. They would not stop to ask why a seasoned forensic accountant would surrender so quickly. They would only see the money. We barely had to wait 20 minutes. Roxanne's phone rang again. She answered and placed it back on the speaker. The opposing lawyer sounded incredibly smug. He announced that his client was willing to entertain a settlement discussion, but they had specific conditions. Chase was demanding that the meeting take place tomorrow morning at exactly 10 o'clock. He also insisted that his mother Diane be permitted to attend the meeting as his primary emotional support. He wanted to parade his victory in front of the woman who had helped him orchestrate the extortion. Roxanne feigned a slight hesitation, acting as if she were reluctantly conceding ground. She agreed to the time and the guest list. She confirmed that the conference would take place in her primary boardroom, assuring the lawyer that we were preparing the necessary financial transfer documents to satisfy the $250,000 demand. The lawyer smugly advised us to ensure the coffee was hot and abruptly ended the call. I looked directly at Roxanne across the glass desk and let out a long, deeply satisfying breath. The bait had been taken with spectacular ease. Chase was completely blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need for cash. He genuinely believed he had bullied a forensic accountant into handing over a massive fortune. He believed he was going to strut into a corporate law office, collect a settlement check, refill the stolen Vanguard escrow account, and walk away as a victorious victim. He had no idea that the settlement documents waiting for him tomorrow morning would be nothing more than empty paper. I spent the remainder of the afternoon working alongside Roxanne's legal team, ensuring every detail of the trap was flawlessly executed. We prepared the large glass-walled conference room at the end of the hall. We set up the chairs, arranged the water pitchers, and printed out massive stacks of decoy settlement contracts to make the room look legitimate. I wanted Chase and Diane to feel the dizzying high of impending wealth right up until the exact second I pulled the floor out from under them. I wanted them to sit in those plush leather chairs and taste the victory before it turned to ash in their mouths. As the sun began to set over the city, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors of the law firm, I finally packed up my laptop. Tomorrow morning, Chase and Diane were going to willingly leave the safety and comfort of my luxury condo to collect their heavily anticipated prize. They were going to walk straight into an environment completely controlled by my resources and my intellect. They thought they were coming to dictate the terms of my surrender, completely oblivious to the federal authorities who were reviewing the evidence I had provided. They were actually arriving to attend their own devastating, highly publicized financial and social funeral. I walked out of the executive office, stepped into the elevator, and headed back to my downtown hotel. I stepped out of the elevator into the lobby of my hotel, fully expecting to spend the evening reviewing the final trap we had set at the law firm. My phone rang before I even reached my suite. It was Roxanne. Her voice was tight with a mixture of annoyance and dark amusement. She told me that Chase's predatory lawyer had just called back with a sudden, arrogant change of plans. Chase was refusing to walk into our corporate law office the next morning. He felt that yielding to our location gave us too much power. Instead, he and Diane were insisting that I bring the settlement documents and the financial transfer confirmation to the Vanguard Pinnacle Estates annual charity gala tomorrow evening. Roxanne explained their transparent strategy. The gala was the most highly publicized luxury real estate event of the season, packed with Chicago's corporate elite wealthy investors and high society figures. Chase intentionally chose this venue to force me into a psychological corner. He assumed that I, as a respected professional, would be absolutely terrified of making a scene in front of the city's most influential people. He believed the opulent public setting would guarantee my complete submission. He wanted me to quietly hand over $250,000 while he stood on his home turf, surrounded by his wealthy clients and colleagues, validating his fabricated victimhood. I told Roxanne to agree to his terms immediately. I did not feel cornered by his venue change. I felt a surge of cold, thrilling anticipation. Chase thought he was bringing me to his victory lap, completely unaware that he had just invited me to execute him on his own brightly lit stage. The state regulatory investigators already possessed the explosive digital dossier proving his massive embezzlement. By moving the meeting to his corporate charity gala, he was guaranteeing that his entire professional network, his managing brokers, and the local media would be present for the catastrophic fallout. The next 24 hours passed in a state of hyper-focused preparation. I did not just want to attend the gala. I wanted to arrive projecting absolute unbothered power. I spent the afternoon at a luxury boutique selecting an outfit that left absolutely no room for vulnerability. I chose a stunning floor-length emerald green gown with sharp architectural lines that perfectly matched the cold calculation in my chest. I had my hair swept into a sleek, flawless style and wore the subtle, expensive jewelry that Diane had always bitterly coveted. I was not going to walk into that ballroom looking like a defeated, financially abused ex-fiancé. I was going to walk in looking like the wealthy forensic accountant who owned the entire room. When my black town car pulled up to the grand entrance of the historic downtown hotel, hosting the Vanguard Pinnacle Estates Gala, the flash of cameras immediately illuminated the rainy street. I stepped out of the car, adjusting the strap of my sleek leather briefcase, holding the decoy settlement papers. The massive ballroom was an overwhelming display of orchestrated wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests, dressed in custom tuxedos and designer gowns. Waiters circulated with silver trays of champagne, while a string quartet played softly in the background. It was the exact type of environment where Chase desperately wanted to belong, funded entirely by the earnest money he had systematically stolen from the people mingling in this very room. I moved through the crowded ballroom with slow, deliberate steps. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my expression an impenetrable mask of calm confidence. Several mutual acquaintances who had eagerly participated in his digital smear campaign noticed me. I saw their eyes widen in shock, expecting me to be hiding in shame. I did not avoid their gaze. I met their stares, directly holding eye contact until they nervously looked away and whispered to each other. I was not here to seek their approval or beg for their understanding. It took me less than 5 minutes to locate Chase and Diane. They were holding court near a towering ice sculpture surrounded by a group of sympathetic real estate brokers. Chase was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was leaning heavily on a pair of silver crutches, his braced leg prominently displayed for maximum pity. He was nodding solemnly as a wealthy older woman patted his arm, playing the role of the brave, injured survivor. Diane stood right beside him wearing a glittering silver dress that she had undoubtedly purchased with stolen escrow funds. She was smiling graciously, playing the devoted, traumatized mother. Diane spotted me first. Her gracious smile instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of genuine panic that she quickly masked with a vicious, triumphant sneer. She tapped Chase on the arm and whispered in his ear. Chase turned to look at me, and his chest puffed out with undeniable arrogance. He excused himself from his admiring audience and hobbled over to me, Diane trailing closely behind him like a loyal shadow. They did not want to conduct the transaction in the middle of the crowd. Chase gestured toward a semi-private VIP lounge area, elevated slightly above the main ballroom floor, separated by heavy velvet ropes. It offered the perfect vantage point. They could remain visible to their elite peers to ensure I behaved, while maintaining enough distance to quietly extort me. I followed them up the short ramp and stepped into the VIP area. Chase maneuvered himself onto a plush leather sofa, resting his crutches against a glass table. Diane stood behind him, crossing her arms defensively. She looked me up and down, taking in my emerald gown and flawless appearance, her eyes burning with deep, ingrained resentment. "I am honestly surprised you actually showed up," Chase said, his voice dropping into a smug, condescending whisper. "I thought you would send your pit bull lawyer to do your dirty work. But I guess you finally realized you cannot bully your way out of the truth. You realized how much you have to lose." "You requested my presence, Chase," I replied smoothly, setting my leather briefcase down on the glass table. "I am simply here to conclude our business and finalize the paperwork." Diane let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Look at you all dressed up, pretending you are not completely terrified. You thought your money made you untouchable, Whitney. But you are about to write a massive check to my son just to save your pathetic, lonely reputation. I hope you finally learned your place." I looked at Diane, absorbing the sheer breathtaking scale of her delusion. She genuinely believed this was a moment of supreme victory. She believed she had successfully conquered me. I reached down and snapped the brass latches of my briefcase open. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not reach for a bank transfer confirmation. I slowly withdrew the thick stack of decoy settlement contracts Roxanne had drafted. "The paperwork is all here," I said quietly, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Exactly as you demanded." Chase reached out eagerly to grab the documents, his eyes gleaming with unadulterated greed. He was so entirely focused on the stack of paper in his hands that he did not notice the heavy rhythmic thud of approaching footsteps marching across the ballroom floor behind me. He did not notice that the string quartet had abruptly stopped playing, or that the ambient chatter of the gala had suddenly dropped into a confused, terrified silence. He was completely blind to the reality closing in on him. He snatched the thick stack of paper from my hands with the desperate eagerness of a starving man. He did not bother reading the dense legal clauses or the indemnification paragraphs Roxanne had meticulously drafted. He flipped straight to the final page, searching only for the signature line and the specified settlement amount. A slow, deeply satisfied smile stretched across his face as he saw the number printed in bold black ink. $250,000. He traced his finger over the zeros, his breathing growing slightly heavier as the reality of the money seemingly materialized right in front of him. He tossed the packet onto the glass table, leaning back against the plush leather cushions of the sofa. He crossed his arms over his chest, projecting the manufactured confidence of a man who believed he had just conquered a giant. He told me that I had finally made a smart financial decision. He stated that as soon as the cashier check cleared his personal account, he would formally instruct his attorney to withdraw the civil lawsuit and drop the physical assault claims. He promised to have his bags packed and vacate my condo by noon tomorrow, graciously allowing me to return to my own home. Diane reached out and picked up her crystal flute from the table, taking a long celebratory sip of champagne. She settled back into her chair, crossing her legs and looking at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated venom. She told me that she always knew I would eventually crack under the pressure. She said that people like me, people who scraped their way up from working-class neighborhoods, were always terrified of losing the fragile social status they had bought for themselves. She waved her hand dismissively, the expensive silver fabric of her stolen dress catching the light of the overhead chandelier. She laughed softly, a sharp grating sound that barely carried over the ambient noise of the gala. Diane leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, and stared directly into my eyes. She told me that this entire humiliating ordeal was a necessary lesson in respect. She stated that I had walked around for 3 years acting superior just because I owned a successful forensic accounting business. She claimed I treated her son like a charity case, constantly emasculating him with my wealth and my independent career. Diane took another sip of champagne and proudly announced that she had finally put the arrogant working-class girl exactly in her place. She said that writing this massive check was my ultimate punishment for daring to think I was better than their family. She demanded that I hand over the certified bank draft immediately so they could go back to enjoying the luxury gala that they rightfully belonged to. I listened to her toxic, delusional monologue without blinking. I did not feel the sudden urge to defend my background or justify my professional success. I just watched her drink champagne purchased with stolen earnest money, reveling in a victory that was entirely fabricated. I looked at the tailored lines of her silver gown, knowing exactly which luxury boutique she had purchased it from and exactly which innocent family had unwittingly funded it. She possessed a breathtaking level of cognitive dissonance, sitting there lecturing me about class and morality while operating a massive corporate embezzlement ring out of a fake interior design company. I did not interrupt her tirade. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her bitter words to settle heavily into the atmosphere of the private room. Chase picked up a silver pen from the table and clicked it twice, eager to execute the final signature. He demanded the physical check again, his voice carrying a harsh, impatient edge. He told me to stop dragging the process out and hand over the money so he could permanently erase me from his life. He claimed that every second he had to spend looking at my face was causing him severe emotional distress, perfectly reciting the ridiculous language his personal injury lawyer had drafted in the civil complaint. He tapped the tip of the pen against the thick glass tabletop, his eyes darting down to my leather briefcase. I kept my hands resting calmly on the brass latches of my empty bag. I told Chase that there was no cashier check waiting for him inside my briefcase tonight. I explained that before any financial transfer could be authorized, there was one final, unavoidable administrative detail that needed to be formally addressed in front of his managing employers. Chase frowned deeply, the silver pen halting its tapping against the glass. He asked me what I was talking about, his arrogant posture stiffening with the very first tiny flicker of genuine confusion. He looked at Diane, searching for an explanation, but her smug smile had also faltered slightly at my calm refusal to produce the money. Chase demanded to know why his employers needed to be involved in a private domestic settlement, his voice dropping into a harsh, nervous whisper. He accused me of playing stupid mind games and threatened to walk away from the table and double his financial demands in court if I did not hand over the check immediately. He aggressively reminded me that he held the keys to my home and that he was perfectly willing to destroy my corporate reputation with another round of vicious social media posts. I looked at his injured leg propped up on the sofa like a theatrical prop, and then I looked directly into his angry, desperate eyes. I told him that I did not care about his social media posts, his fake lawsuit, or the locks on my front door. I stated that the only thing I cared about was ensuring his accounting ledger was perfectly balanced before the end of the night. Chase opened his mouth to shout another threat, fully intending to intimidate me back into submission. He did not have the chance to demand another answer or utter a single word. The heavy, rhythmic footsteps that had been marching across the ballroom floor finally reached the perimeter of the elevated lounge area. The thick velvet ropes were unclipped and tossed aside with swift, aggressive force. Chase turned his head, a look of profound annoyance crossing his features. He fully expected to see a curious gala guest or a wandering waiter interrupting his private transaction. He was entirely unprepared for the reality that had just arrived at his table. The quiet music and ambient chatter of the party seemed to vanish, completely replaced by a suffocating tension that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. The destruction of his entire life was standing right behind him. Standing just inches beyond the velvet ropes were three individuals whose presence immediately stripped the artificial confidence from Chase's face. The man positioned directly in the center was Jonathan Pierce, the senior managing broker and majority owner of Vanguard Pinnacle Estates. Jonathan's usually polished, jovial demeanor was completely gone, replaced by an expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. Flanking him on either side were two stern men wearing dark conservative suits. They held leather identification wallets in their hands, the silver shields of the State Financial Regulatory Commission catching the golden light of the chandeliers. Chase blinked rapidly, his arrogant posture instantly dissolving into a posture of profound confusion. He looked from Jonathan to the two state investigators, his mind desperately trying to comprehend why the senior leadership of his brokerage was crashing a private domestic settlement. He let out a nervous, breathy chuckle, attempting to salvage his carefully constructed facade. He leaned back on the plush leather sofa and gestured toward me with a dismissive wave of his hand. He told Jonathan that this was just a private misunderstanding with a bitter former partner. He pointed to the bulky black medical brace strapped to his leg and claimed that he was simply trying to resolve a personal injury dispute so he could return his full focus to selling luxury real estate. Jonathan did not smile back. He did not ask about the brace or offer a single word of sympathy. He stared down at Chase with a look of absolute disgust, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched near his ear. He told Chase to shut his mouth and keep his hands perfectly visible on the glass table. The sudden harsh command from his boss caused Chase to flinch. He reached for the settlement contract sitting on the table, perhaps hoping that securing my signature would somehow legitimize his standing or provide him with the funds to buy his way out of whatever trouble had just arrived. I reached down into my open leather briefcase and withdrew the true centerpiece of the evening. It was a massive, heavily bound audit report. The document was over 200 pages long, secured with thick metal binding rings, and clearly labeled with the official seal of my forensic accounting firm. I lifted the heavy binder and slid it across the smooth glass table. It came to a stop right on top of his useless settlement demands with a loud, definitive thud. I kept my voice perfectly calm and mathematically precise. I told Chase that we were no longer discussing fake knee injuries or fabricated domestic abuse. We were going to discuss the precise mechanics of federal wire fraud and systemic corporate embezzlement. The color began to visibly drain from Chase's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Diane, who had been confidently sipping her champagne just moments before, slowly lowered her crystal flute. Her smug, victorious smile completely vanished, replaced by a sudden sharp look of predatory panic. I opened the heavy cover of the audit report, revealing the first page of color-coded spreadsheets and banking records. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried clearly through the heavy silence of the VIP room. I meticulously detailed the events of the past week. I explained how Chase had illegally broken into my secured home office to steal my confidential tax returns. I laid out the exact timeline of his fraudulent secondary mortgage application, describing how he had digitally forged my signature onto a fake power of attorney document in a desperate bid to extract $250,000 from my property equity. Chase opened his mouth to deny the accusations, but his voice failed him, resulting in a weak, pathetic stammer. I did not stop. I turned to the next section of the audit report, sliding a high-resolution printout of his banking disbursement instructions across the glass table. I pointed to the specific routing number he had provided to my private wealth manager. I announced to the entire room that Chase had not intended to keep all the stolen mortgage funds for himself. He had explicitly directed $45,000 to be wired directly into the Vanguard Pinnacle Estates Client Escrow Trust. Jonathan Pierce let out a sharp, ragged breath, his hands balling into tight fists at his sides as he heard the name of his company's sacred escrow account spoken aloud. I turned my attention directly to Diane. I informed her that the $45,000 she had aggressively demanded in my kitchen was never meant for a wedding caterer or a florist. It was the exact amount of an earnest money deposit for a $4.5 million luxury estate scheduled to close next Friday. I explained that Chase had stolen that specific deposit weeks ago, and my refusal to hand over my debit card had completely collapsed his timeline for replacing the missing cash before the impending state regulatory audit at the end of the month. Diane's hands began to shake violently. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers, tipping over and spilling pale yellow liquid across the glass table, soaking into the edges of the decoy settlement papers. I turned the page of the forensic binder, exposing the massive, undeniable scope of their combined criminal enterprise. I stated that he had not successfully closed a single legitimate luxury home sale in 8 consecutive months. Instead, he had been representing wealthy buyers on multi-million-dollar contracts that suspiciously fell through during the inspection periods. I traced the exact digital path of every single stolen cent. I mapped out how Chase had siphoned hundreds of thousands of dollars from those failed contracts, bleeding the client escrow trust dry. I explained how he fabricated fraudulent vendor invoices for staging and repairs to authorize the illegal payouts. I read aloud the transaction records for the monthly lease payments on his luxury sports car, the exorbitant initiation fees for his elite country club, and the designer clothing Diane was currently wearing. Chase stared at the massive, perfectly documented forensic audit report sitting on the table. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as the absolute reality of his destruction crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. He was not looking at a bitter ex-partner making wild accusations. He was looking at a flawlessly constructed, empirically undeniable roadmap to a federal prison sentence. Every stolen cent, every forged document, and every illegally accessed escrow account was laid bare under the bright, unforgiving lights of the ballroom chandelier. The entitled man who had tried to extort me for my home was completely gone. In his place sat a terrified criminal realizing his life was over. Diane stared at the spilled champagne dripping off the glass table. The crystal flute had shattered against the brass base of the sofa. She could not tear her eyes away from the audit report between us. The silver dress she wore to project superiority now looked like a cheap costume. Her chest rose and fell in erratic jerks as she processed the sheer magnitude of the trap I built. She had spent the evening believing she was a mastermind. Now she was an exposed money launderer, staring at the evidence of her impending incarceration. I did not offer her a single shred of sympathy. I slowly lifted my arm and checked my gold wristwatch. The second hand ticked past 12. I looked back up at Chase, who was still gasping for air, as if the room had suddenly been submerged in water. I explained that professional courtesy required me to provide copies to the relevant authorities before discussing the findings with the target of the investigation. I kept my voice calm, ensuring every word carried the weight of absolute finality. I revealed that I had digitally submitted the entire explosive dossier to the State Real Estate Licensing Board and the district attorney exactly 48 hours ago. Chase let out a strangled sound halfway between a sob and a gasp. He looked desperately up at his managing broker, Jonathan Pierce, hoping to find a trace of professional mercy. Jonathan simply took a slow step backward, physically distancing himself from the toxic contamination of a proven embezzler. I stated that the district attorney had spent the last 2 days verifying my spreadsheets, cross-referencing forged invoices, and securing federal warrants for the shell accounts registered to his mother. I told him I agreed to meet him at his corporate charity gala tonight for one specific reason. I wanted to guarantee that when state investigators finally came to execute those warrants, they would not have to look far to find him. Right on cue, 2 stern men wearing dark suits stepped past the velvet ropes and moved directly into the VIP lounge. The taller investigator reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of official court documents. He did not introduce himself politely or offer a handshake. He addressed Chase by his full legal name, his voice booming with the undeniable, terrifying authority of the state government. The investigator announced that Chase was under immediate arrest for multiple counts of felony wire fraud, systemic corporate embezzlement, and severe identity theft. He instructed Chase to stand up and place his hands securely behind his back. Chase did not move. He seemed paralyzed by the sheer reality of his consequences. He looked down at his bulky black medical brace, attempting one final play for unearned sympathy. He whined that he was severely injured and could not possibly walk to a police cruiser. The second investigator was unfazed by the theatrical display. He signaled to the perimeter of the room. 2 uniformed local police officers, quietly waiting by the service elevators, marched up the ramp and into the lounge. They approached the sofa with heavy, purposeful strides. The officers did not ask nicely. They grabbed Chase by his shoulders and hauled him forcefully to his feet, ignoring his dramatic winces and pathetic complaints about his knee. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed loudly in the quiet room. It was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my life. Diane snapped out of her paralyzed shock. She lunged forward, grabbing the arm of the nearest police officer, screaming that this was all a massive misunderstanding. She shrieked that I was a vindictive woman trying to ruin her son's life over a canceled wedding. The taller state investigator turned his cold gaze onto Diane. He informed her that a separate federal warrant with her name on it was waiting regarding her fraudulent interior design consulting business. He strongly advised her to step back and remain perfectly quiet, or she would be leaving the charity gala in matching steel handcuffs. Diane shrank back into the shadows of the sofa, covering her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing her arrogant greed had destroyed both their lives. The police officers turned Chase around and marched him toward the exit of the VIP lounge. Chase stumbled slightly, his face red with a mixture of profound shame and panicked tears. He looked back at me over his shoulder, his eyes silently begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I simply stared back at him with an expression of cold, impenetrable stone. I had given him exactly what he earned. As the officers escorted Chase down the ramp and onto the main floor of the grand ballroom, the devastating reality of his public execution began. The charity gala had come to a complete standstill. Hundreds of Chicago's wealthiest corporate elite high society figures and influential real estate investors stood frozen in place watching the spectacle unfold. Chase was paraded directly through the center of the massive room. The route the officers took was long and completely exposed. There was no hidden service exit for him to use. He had to endure the scorching, humiliated stares of every single person he had desperately tried to impress. I walked slowly down the ramp, standing at the edge of the ballroom floor, to watch the final moments of his destruction. I saw wealthy clients pointing and whispering in disgusted shock. I saw his managing brokers shaking their heads in furious disbelief. The local media photographers hired to cover the glamorous event immediately turned their flashing lenses toward the incredible scandal. They furiously snapped dozens of pictures of the supposedly elite luxury broker being dragged through a ballroom in handcuffs. In a matter of 60 seconds, Chase lost absolutely everything. His highly coveted real estate license was effectively terminated. His professional reputation was utterly annihilated. His carefully cultivated social standing among the city's elite was permanently burned to the ground. He was no longer the charming, successful broker he had pretended to be. He was just an exposed thief, taking a highly publicized walk of absolute shame. I stood in the golden light of the chandeliers, my emerald gown catching the flashes of the press cameras. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I had systematically dismantled a predator who thought he could use my home and wealth to escape his criminal consequences. I watched the heavy wooden doors of the grand ballroom swing shut behind the police officers, effectively sealing his miserable fate. It was over. He would never be able to hurt me again. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom clicked shut, sealing away the panicked murmurs and frantic whispers of Chicago's real estate elite. I remained standing at the edge of the elevated lounge, the cool glass of my briefcase handle pressing against my palm. The string quartet had abandoned their instruments, and the remaining guests were staring at the exit where Chase had just been dragged away in steel handcuffs. Diane was still cowering on the plush leather sofa, her face buried in her hands, her silver designer gown looking like a wrinkled, pathetic shell. She did not look up at me. She did not scream any more threats or hurl any insults about my working-class background. The suffocating arrogance that fueled her for 3 years had been vaporized by the terrifying threat of federal prison. I turned away from the wreckage of their lives, walked down the carpeted ramp, and glided right through the center of the stunned crowd. The crisp night air of the city hit my face as I stepped out of the hotel lobby carrying a profound sense of absolute victory. The swift and brutal reality of the justice system descended upon Chase with terrifying efficiency. The morning following the charity gala, I sat in Roxanne's law office, sipping hot coffee while we reviewed the initial filings from the federal prosecutor. Because we handed them a perfectly documented forensic roadmap, the grand jury returned a staggering multi-count federal indictment before the weekend was even over. Chase was officially charged with severe wire fraud, systemic corporate embezzlement, and aggravated identity theft for forging the power of attorney document. The judge presiding over his arraignment took one look at his flight risk potential and the massive scale of the stolen earnest money and immediately denied bail. The arrogant man who proudly lounged on my custom sofa demanding $250,000 was now sitting in a cold concrete holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit. His professional execution was just as merciless. The State Real Estate Licensing Board held an emergency disciplinary hearing that same week. They did not wait for the criminal trial to conclude. Based on the undeniable evidence of the client escrow theft and the fraudulent invoices, the board permanently revoked his broker license. He was officially banned from ever practicing real estate or handling financial transactions in the state again. Vanguard Pinnacle Estates immediately issued a harsh public statement, formally terminating his employment and announcing their full, unwavering cooperation with the federal investigation. Every wealthy client he had tried to impress, every colleague he had boasted to, and every mutual friend who blindly supported his vicious social media smear campaign now knew the undeniable truth. The public narrative shifted violently overnight. The people who had flooded my phone with hateful messages were suddenly rushing to delete their comments, desperately trying to distance themselves from a documented federal criminal. Chase had weaponized his social standing to destroy me, but he ultimately orchestrated his own spectacular, highly publicized demise. With Chase locked away in federal custody and his fraudulent income stream completely severed, Diane's entire world began to violently collapse. The federal authorities had immediately frozen every single bank account tied to her fake interior design consulting firm, classifying her assets as the direct proceeds of corporate money laundering. Without the stolen escrow funds to artificially prop up her lavish lifestyle, The consequences of her immense greed arrived with devastating speed. The very first casualties were the luxury vehicles. I was standing in the lobby of my condo building with Roxanne and two armed private security contractors when the repo men arrived. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, I watched the heavy tow trucks pull up to the loading dock. They efficiently hooked up the sleek sports car Chase loved to flaunt, followed immediately by the luxury SUV Diane drove to her weekly spa appointments. Diane came rushing out of the private elevator, her hair unkempt and her face pale with frantic desperation. She shrieked at the tow truck drivers demanding they release her property, but they simply handed her the default notices and drove away, leaving her standing on the wet pavement with absolutely nothing. The repossession was just the beginning of her humiliating descent. Because Chase was incarcerated and his assets frozen by the federal government, the absurd squatter strategy they tried to use against me completely disintegrated. Roxanne secured an expedited emergency eviction order from a judge who was thoroughly disgusted by the fraudulent mortgage attempt. I walked out of the lobby and approached Diane as she stood shivering on the sidewalk. I held out the court-mandated eviction order, the official seal stamped heavily at the bottom of the page. I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of the anger that had consumed me a week ago. I told her she had exactly 1 hour to pack her belongings and vacate my property, or my security team would physically carry her out and leave her bags on the curb. Diane did not attempt to argue. The vicious, entitled woman who wore my silk bathrobe and demanded my wealth was entirely broken. She slowly walked back into the building, her shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. I followed her up to my penthouse, standing by the front door with my security team as she frantically shoved her clothes into cheap cardboard boxes. She tried to take several expensive decorative items that belonged to me, but Roxanne coldly instructed her to put them down, reminding her the federal investigators were still deciding whether to charge her as a co-conspirator in the money laundering scheme. Diane dropped the items, her hands shaking violently. She dragged her taped boxes into the hallway, not daring to look me in the eye as she surrendered the keys to my home. The isolation Diane experienced in the aftermath of the scandal was absolute. She desperately tried to reach out to her elite country club friends, hoping to find a wealthy ally who would loan her money or offer her a place to stay. She called the affluent women she spent years gossiping with, expecting the safety net of high society to catch her. Instead, she was met with cold, impenetrable walls. The country club quietly revoked her membership, citing the criminal investigation into her consulting firm. The women she desperately tried to impress completely blacklisted her, treating her like a toxic contagion. They refused to answer her frantic phone calls and instructed their doormen to turn her away if she ever showed up at their estates. She was entirely shunned by the world she obsessively worshipped. With no stolen money to fund her delusions and no social circle to rescue her, Diane was forced to face the harsh, unforgiving reality of her actual circumstances. She had to use the last remaining scraps of her legitimate savings to rent a tiny run-down studio apartment on the far outskirts of the city. The building had peeling paint, flickering hallway lights, and no concierge to greet her at the door. It was a bleak, cramped space that smelled faintly of old smoke and damp carpet. She traded the sprawling luxury of my penthouse for a miserable, solitary confinement of her own making. Every time she looked out her small, dirty window, she would have to remember the incredible greed that put her there. The very next morning, the last, lingering thread of Chase's attempted extortion was officially severed. I was sitting at my desk in my temporary hotel suite when Roxanne called with the final piece of legal victory. She informed me that the personal injury law firm representing Chase had formally filed a motion to dismiss their civil lawsuit with prejudice. The moment the federal indictment was unsealed and the details of his massive escrow theft became public knowledge, his sleazy attorney completely panicked. The lawyer realized that pursuing a fabricated assault and emotional distress claim on behalf of a documented federal criminal would not just result in a humiliating defeat in civil court. It would likely expose their law firm to severe sanctions and investigations for actively participating in a fraudulent extortion attempt. They dropped Chase as a client, immediately completely abandoning him to deal with his federal charges alone. The terrifying threat of losing $250,000 or the physical deed to my home completely evaporated into thin air, leaving absolutely nothing behind. I thanked Roxanne for her relentless advocacy, closed my laptop, and began the process of moving back into my own life. Returning to my luxury condo for the first time after Diane's eviction was a surreal experience. The physical space was exactly as I had left it, but the atmosphere felt heavily contaminated by their brief toxic occupation. I walked through the spacious living room, looking at the custom Italian leather sofa where Chase had arrogantly propped up his braced leg while demanding my wealth. I walked into the kitchen and stared at the marble island where Diane had screamed at me, the exact spot where Chase had raised his fist in a desperate attempt to force my submission. I realized immediately that simply hiring a premium cleaning service would never be enough to reclaim my sanctuary. I needed to completely eradicate every single physical trace of their existence from my home. I contacted one of the most exclusive interior design and contracting firms in the city. I handed them a massive budget and gave them absolute creative control with one strict directive. I wanted the entire condo gutted and completely reimagined. For the next 2 months, I remained in my comfortable hotel suite while the demolition crews tore the condo down to the bare concrete studs. They ripped out the thick hardwood floors where Chase had fallen, clutching his knee. They completely demolished the central kitchen island and replaced the dark marble countertops with stunning, luminous white quartz. They painted the walls in bright, calming colors, erasing the dark shadows that had once filled the space. I hired a specialized technology firm to install a completely new military-grade smart home security system, ensuring that no one could ever bypass my digital locks or compromise my personal safety again. They brought in entirely new luxury furniture, replacing every single item Diane had dared to touch or claim as her own. When the contractors finally handed me back the keys, I walked into a home that was entirely unrecognizable from the battlefield it had briefly become. It was a pristine, peaceful environment that reflected nothing but my own success, personal safety, and unyielding independence. While my physical home was being completely rebuilt, my professional career experienced an unprecedented, explosive surge in prestige. The details of my meticulous forensic investigation did not stay buried in the federal court filings. The high society guests who witnessed Chase being hauled out of the Vanguard Pinnacle Estates charity gala could not stop talking about the dramatic sequence of events. Word spread rapidly through the elite circles of the city, rippling from luxury real estate brokers directly to corporate boardrooms and major financial institutions. The story of how a forensic accountant had systematically mapped out a massive corporate embezzlement ring over a single weekend became legendary within the financial sector. Executives at massive corporations realized the sheer caliber of my analytical skills. They recognized that if I could dismantle a complex money laundering operation hidden deep inside a highly regulated escrow trust, with zero inside access, I could uncover absolutely any financial vulnerability within their own companies. My firm was suddenly flooded with urgent requests for high-stakes corporate audits. I began receiving lucrative contract offers from multinational conglomerates, seeking to retain my services to bulletproof their internal accounting ledgers. I had to quickly lease a much larger commercial office space in a premier downtown high-rise and hire an entire team of junior analysts just to keep up with the incredible demand. The smear campaign Chase had tried to use to destroy my reputation had spectacularly backfired. Instead of making me look like an unstable, abusive partner, his actions had inadvertently provided me with the greatest professional marketing campaign money could ever buy. I was no longer just a respected accountant. I had become one of the most feared and highly sought-after financial investigators in the entire region. The very people who had sent me hateful messages during his social media tirade were now desperately trying to hire my firm to protect their own massive assets. 6 months after the canceled wedding, I walked into my newly renovated condo after a remarkably successful day at the office. The quiet, serene atmosphere of the entryway washed over me instantly, dissolving the residual stress of the corporate world. I hung my keys on a small brass hook by the door. I slipped off my tailored suit jacket and walked into the pristine kitchen, feeling the smooth, polished stone of the new floor beneath my bare feet. I opened the climate-controlled wine fridge and selected a very rare, expensive bottle of red wine I had purchased specifically to celebrate a recently acquired corporate account. I took a silver corkscrew from the drawer and pulled the cork, letting the rich aroma fill the room. I poured a generous amount into a heavy crystal glass, the deep ruby liquid catching the warm, inviting glow of the modern pendant lights suspended above the bright quartz island. I walked across the plush new living room carpet, slid the heavy glass balcony door open, and stepped out into the cool, refreshing evening air. The sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline stretched out before me, a glittering sea of lights reflecting off the dark surface of the lake. I leaned against the sturdy metal railing, taking a slow, deep sip of the rich wine. I thought about the greedy man who had arrogantly tried to steal my wealth, and the bitter woman who had loudly demanded my respect simply for existing. They were both locked away in their respective prisons, completely powerless, financially ruined, and entirely forgotten by the society they idolized so desperately. I looked out over the sprawling city architecture, feeling a profound, unshakable sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. I had faced a terrifying, coordinated extortion attempt that maliciously threatened to destroy everything I had spent my entire adult life building. But I did not cower. I did not surrender to their manipulation. I had utilized my intellect, my rigorous professional resilience, and my unwavering belief in my own inherent worth to completely dismantle their predatory attacks. I raised my crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the quiet night sky, reveling in the absolute power and freedom I had secured completely on my own. The ordeal I went through taught me a profound lesson about the nature of true power and personal independence. Often, toxic individuals rely on manipulation, emotional extortion, and the threat of public humiliation to force their victims into submission. They operate on the arrogant assumption that if they isolate you from your support network and weaponize your reputation against you, you will eventually crumble. However, true strength lies in refusing to participate in their chaotic emotional games. When you are faced with relentless abuse or exploitation, the most effective weapon you possess is absolute unwavering clarity. Panic and emotional reactions are exactly what manipulative people anticipate because it fuels their delusion of control. By stepping back, detaching emotionally, and applying cold empirical logic to the situation, you completely strip them of their power. Financial independence is not just about having wealth. It is about having the tangible freedom to enforce your boundaries, protect your sanctuary, and walk away from anyone who attempts to compromise your safety. Furthermore, we are often conditioned to believe that we must shrink ourselves to keep the peace, especially when facing pressure from those who invoke family loyalty. But loyalty should never be a disguise for theft or abuse. Your success, your intelligence, and your resilience are not flaws to be hidden, nor are they resources for toxic people to extract. When you stand firmly in your truth and refuse to be gaslit, the fragile facades constructed by greedy individuals will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own lies. Justice may require intense patience and meticulous preparation, but when you build it on a foundation of undeniable truth, it is absolute. Have you ever been pushed into a corner by toxic people who tried to use your own success or reputation against you? How did you find the courage to stand your ground, set firm boundaries, and fight back? Please share your story in the comments below. If my journey of reclaiming my home, exposing the truth, and securing my absolute freedom resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about resilience and ultimate justice. Remember, your peace and your power belong entirely to you, and you should never apologize for fiercely protecting them.